hotel complex where a goodly number of Western firms have offices. We haven't heard anything about casualties in there. It looked as if those two rocket-propelled grenades, if they were in fact that, bounced off the side of the building and didn't penetrate the building or hit an area where there was glass. Now, we see some APCs moving back in our direction from positions they had taken up near the Ukraine Hotel. To give our viewers an idea, that is probably 400 yards across the Moscow River, directly facing the Russian White House.
I'd also like to point out where the Mezh, the International Hotel, is. That is an approach road from Russian television. It may well have been that some of those attackers of Russian television came back. We know they were armed with those rocket-propelled grenades. They may have come back trying to re-enter the White House. There's a heavy line of troops along that perimeter of the White House, along that side of the White House near the Metropolitan Hotel, and they may have engaged in a street battle in which they launched that grenade against the Mezh.
And yet again, the crowd is changing sides of the bridge, but no sooner do they get to one side and others go back to the other. It seems like an interchange of curiosity seekers.
What's become of the black berets that we saw being deployed? Have they gone anywhere where we can see them?
I cannot see them with the naked eye. I don't know what our camera will show you, but I can't see that unit in the crowd. They did move into the crowd, and they may well have moved on past the end of this crowd down towards those water trucks. As a matter of fact, I think I know what's happening. They're bringing all of the bystanders off the bridge. They seem to have gone down to the barricade that was created by those water tank trucks. We can now see the crowd moving towards us en masse, and that says to me that behind them are those black beret troops who have finally moved in to get these curiosity seekers off that very dangerous bridge.
They seem to form a human wall that's pushing the curiosity seekers off. They had riot shields with them, some of them had automatic weapons, which they may be firing into the air to get the attention and tell people that this is serious, they've got to get away from it.
Moving crowds and the crackle of gunfire in Moscow right now. Our live coverage of the battle for the Russian parliament will continue in a moment.
All morning we've been telling you about the gunfire that has been occurring outside the Russian White House in Moscow between pro-Yeltsin forces, pro-Yeltsin troops, and anti-Yeltsin people who are holed up inside the Russian White House. We go now to ABC's Mike Lee in Moscow for the latest on the situation. Mike, good morning.
Good morning. We're located high in the Ukraine Hotel, as you can see, directly above a bridge. And the picture we're showing you now are riot troops dispersing a crowd, slowly moving them back from a barricade which they have been standing out most of the morning watching the gunfire. And as we slowly pan out, we can show you the scene, which is one of widespread devastation. You will see as we get further to the left the fire damage in the parliament, that mainly from tank shells which have been fired into the building over the past few hours. At the moment, sporadic gunfire, not very much, possibly because we believe that soldiers are inside the parliament building, perhaps going from room to room, trying to either capture people or to take custody of them.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. ABC's Mike Lee in Moscow this morning describing the situation in that city as Boris Yeltsin's troops have been trying to get those people out of the White House.
It is a momentous and historic and a very sad day in Moscow as the huge Russian parliament building known as the White House remains under a siege and occasional attack by Boris Yeltsin's government troops, still attempting to dislodge the 100 or so renegade parliamentarians, their defenders, and others still inside the building. A great deal of damage has been done to the building. Steve Hurst and Eileen O'Connor, although the fighting has been confined to, as you've noted, a relatively small area, that area has been heavily damaged, hasn't it?
It certainly has. The White House itself has been very heavily damaged. There's a fire still raging on the 6th floor of that building. The defenders of the White House had said that they had put out that fire, but it apparently has at least restarted. We can see lots of flames and now smoke coming from offices that previously were not on fire. The building itself was hit many times by armored personnel carriers from Boris Yeltsin's troops firing upon the building, and also from tank fire on the back of the building. Not within our eyesight or camera range is a bunker around which clearly there was a heavy gunfight early this morning. We haven't heard a lot of firing from there. That was the bunker from which the White House had stored most of its weapons and ammunition. But a lot of those weapons and ammunitions clearly were carried to within the White House last night. Every time the defenders of the White House thought they might be under attack, they did used to bring those weapons into the White House. They have automatic weapons, they have rocket-propelled, shoulder-launched grenades. They have claimed that they had surface-to-air missiles. We don't know. In Russia these days, it's very easy to buy heavy weaponry. Anything you want to buy, you can buy. Steve?
Indeed you can, and a lot of the horrible conflicts that are going on around the perimeter of the former Soviet Union are very much fueled by that weapons trade. The Russian army, though showing solidarity here today, has become a virtual peddler of arms. Men in outlying regions of the former Soviet Union selling arms simply to get some money to feed themselves and buy some cigarettes. Here's some gunfire again from the back of the White House, Bob.
Are you saying, Steve, that even civilians in Moscow and in Russia can buy this weaponry?
Absolutely. There is a burgeoning, what we call here mafia. It's just organized criminals, and they are all heavily armed, many of them with these AK-47 assault rifles. The city itself has become pretty much an armed camp. In some circles, you can hear some more gunfire from the back of the White House building. The two sides are trading fire with automatic weapons.
Here you're seeing again that human wall of black berets stopping the bystanders who had gathered at the end of the bridge very close to the gunfire, stopping them from proceeding any further.
I find it strange that although at this moment you hear gunfire from the back of the White House, that there has been this long lull in the heavy fighting that went on for so many hours earlier today. We have no signs that anyone has taken up Mr. Yeltsin's demand that they throw a white flag up and walk out of entrance 20 at the back of the White House. Does that indicate there's some sort of negotiation going on? We don't know, but certainly the big guns have been quiet for a long time now. We have a view down Kutuzovsky Prospect where black beret troops, some of them carrying AK-47 assault rifles, others with riot shields, finally got behind that crowd of onlookers and have pushed them so far slightly more than halfway back off of that bridge to get them out of harm's way. The tanks that were lined up on the bridge pointing their guns at the White House have now turned around and are pointing down the bridge, but their artillery pieces are still pointing at the White House.
Steve, I'm going to have to break in for just a moment. Some local cable operators in the U.S. will be cutting away now for a commercial message. CNN's live coverage of this battle for the Russian parliament will continue nonetheless.
Steve, the Black Berets appear to have done their job very effectively, judging from the sharp line there, beyond which we now see no civilians, no pedestrians rambling.
Indeed, Bob, this is very contrary to the scenes we saw yesterday when demonstrators broke through police line after police line, ran a gauntlet of tear gas and rubber bullets. These people are obviously just curiosity seekers and not eager to face down these riot control police that are slowly pushing them off this bridge and getting them out of the way. A lot of gunshots down where they were. We had a guest on the roof here of the CNN Bureau not long ago, Art Troitsky, who was among that crowd and reported that a lot of them were just school kids out on a lark, sort of dodging the bullets, thinking that was a great fun.
Also, above that line of curiosity seekers, at times you can see at the bottom of the city building, the Moscow city building, there are some men moving around below that building. That building had been taken by anti-Yeltsin demonstrators, pro-Congress demonstrators, so it would be difficult to tell who and which side those men are on. They appear to be coming from within the Moscow city building and trying to cross a street which is covered by Yeltsin forces, and trying to cross the street and get into the White House. So it could be that they are anti-Yeltsin forces.
If we can see our picture of the White House once again, Steve, you mentioned earlier that a force of paratroopers had gone inside and was fighting its way up. Will you outline for us, as best you can, what you think is going on in there?
Well, obviously, Bob, we're not in there, but from what we have seen when we've been in there in the past, these men are going floor by floor, trying to clear the resistance, which I'm sure is very heavy because it's a maze of corridors that had been littered with safes pushed out of offices and filing cabinets to set up firing lanes. Also, the stairwells leading up to the various floors end in these hallways where people defending the White House could set up a crossfire on anyone coming up the stairs. So it's bound to have been a very, very tough fight.
All right, excuse me for a second, Steve and Eileen. For those viewers rejoining us following a local commercial break, CNN is bringing you live coverage of the crisis in Moscow, the ongoing siege of the Russian White House. We also remind you that for a current update of all the day's news, those who wish can tune to Headline News, and we return now to our live coverage.
Inside the Russian White House, there would also be a lot of confusion. Those stairwells that Steve was talking about, there's several different stairwells. There's some stairwells that go to the upper parts of the one section of building that you can see towering above another tier of building. It's very confusing because one stairwell leads to one section of building, another stairwell leads to another section of building. Some of those stairwells are literally right next to each other. A lot of the stairwells are isolated within their own shafts, as you will, and so government troops coming up, especially if there were defenders firing out from doorways, they would be sitting ducks coming up of those stairwells.
Let us briefly recap, excuse me, just 1 second, Steve, for viewers who are just joining us. It is just after 6 o'clock in the morning, New York Eastern time now. To briefly recap, it was about midnight when Russian forces began their assault on the Parliament building. And as Steve Hurst has pointed out, there have been a number of very heavy exchanges of fire from both sides. In the 6 hours that have followed that, there have been untold casualties, and we mean literally untold. We don't know how many dead and wounded, presumably the majority of them inside the building. And the fighting is clear from just watching our pictures, continues up to this moment. President Yeltsin has ordered those inside to come out, to surrender unconditionally. He has said the time for negotiating is over. Those inside the building, the acting president and the parliament chairman, Ruslan Khasbulatov, reject the notion of coming out and surrendering unconditionally. Steve, is that tear gas?
No, it's not tear gas, Bob. It's some sort of smoke screen that's coming out of one of those tanks. There are 4 of them there on the bridge on Kutuzovsky Prospect over the Moscow River. You can see it clearing now. The tanks started their engines, why we don't know again, as this crowd was being pushed off the bridge by black beret riot policemen. The smoke is now cleared. It may just have been one of those big diesels in those T-80 tanks starting its engine and blowing out the cobs, so to speak. Those tanks have periodically shot 125 millimeter artillery shells into the front of the White House at least 10 times, perhaps a few more times. They were lined up with their guns pointing directly at the White House. It's difficult to see right now. We have a live camera inside the Kremlin, and Siobhan Darrow, CNN's Siobhan Darrow, is there standing by with Sergei Stankevich, a top aide to Boris Yeltsin. Siobhan?
Less than 2 miles from the White House, down in the Kremlin, Boris Yeltsin is in his office. He's closely monitoring the situation. He's been up all night meeting with his top advisors. This morning, he's just met with his top military men. Joining us now to discuss the situation is close aide to Boris Yeltsin, Sergei Stankievich. Thanks for being here. Can you tell us what Mr. Yeltsin is doing, what he's feeling right now?
Mr. Yeltsin now is preparing to meet with members of the Cabinet of Ministers later in the afternoon this day, and he is preparing also for tomorrow's very important meeting with leaders of the Russian Federation. And he's going to find a long-term agreement with leaders of the Federation in order to stop any attempts to proclaim new republics or to challenge federal government in some other way.
Well, the provinces have thus far not exactly come out in full support of Boris Yeltsin. Does he expect trouble at that meeting tomorrow?
I think that now they will be more ready to come to agreement with the president because he showed his strength, he showed his ability to control the situation in the country. I think that now agreement is more than possible.
But is the situation going to be under control soon? I mean, there's reports of sporadic gunfire in other parts around the city. Is he going to be able to solve the problem today?
I'm absolutely sure that the situation will be quiet in several hours in Moscow completely, and we have the information that the situation is stable in the rest of the country.
When Boris Yeltsin addressed the nation this morning, appealing for calm, he also spoke of banning opposition and opposition demonstrations. Is this not going to just inflame the situation?
I think not. It's only attempt to enforce the extraordinary situation imposed in Moscow. And at the same time, some political groups openly joined this military putsch and took part in street violence. Such kind of groups, after court procedure, should be forbidden according to the president's rule.
You've been speaking to Mr. Yeltsin all day. As he watches these pictures of the battle going on at the White House, what is he feeling? What is he thinking?
The president is really sad that he didn't manage to prevent this outbreak of violence, but he is at the same time absolutely sure that he did his best in order to continue negotiations. It depends upon his opponents now, and the full responsibility of this violence lays upon leaders of so-called White House.
You said that Mr. Yeltsin had just finished meeting with some of his top military men. How did that meeting go? What kind of orders did Boris Yeltsin give to those people?
The main order is to block this point of violence, point of battling around the White House, and to force people who are there to surrender and to lay down their arms. It's the main order.
Okay, Sergei Stankievich, close aide to Boris Yeltsin, thanks for joining us. I'm Siobhan Darrow, reporting live from inside the Kremlin.
It is, of course, not over yet, and we will resume our live coverage of this violent day in some of the streets of Moscow after this brief break.
Wounded. Military and police sources and Oman sources said that they had also had a lull in the fighting and had given an opportunity to the people within to allow women and children to leave. And that they claim when Oman troops were escorting some of the women and children away from the building, they were fired upon from defenders of the White House.
Did we understand you correctly, Eileen and Steve, that pro-parliament civilians are rushing the building and are being met by gunfire from Yeltsin forces on the lower floors?
That's exactly what we said, Bob. You can still see people rushing across the street that separates the Moscow Municipal Building and the White House. We've got several hundred. There was a news report of 700 people in the center of town. This is apparently that demonstration, a pro-parliament demonstration that was driven out of the center of town by riot police. At one point, a couple of hours ago, we heard a lot of gunfire from the center of the city that presumably was riot police probably firing into the air trying to get these people to move out of the area. So you've got roving bands of people still moving about Moscow, supporting the parliament, and they're going to considerably complicate this effort by the Russian government to take back the White House building, because they now find themselves with civilians at their back. I don't know how much trouble that can cause them, and armed White House defenders above them in the White House. Bob?
It has struck me that despite this upsurge in military power that's taken place overnight, there could still be more. And I've been a little surprised that I haven't seen larger numbers of troops on the streets themselves.
Well, Bob, I think primarily we have a lot of tanks here that can rattle the outside walls and send shells in through windows and certainly demoralize those people inside. And I don't know how many paratroops are inside, but apparently a sufficient number to the military's mind. More fighting.
All right.
Sufficient to the military's mind for this operation, Bob.
Steve and Eileen, I hope you two can find a place to close your eyes for half an hour. We're going to take a brief, we're going to take about a half-hour break right now, and we'll resume our live coverage. You will be doing live updates for us during CNN's Business Morning, which comes up shortly after this. Stay with us.
New laws say your car's air conditioning. Gangs, guns, and violence. It's a crisis in the nation. What's the solution for a society under siege? Get answers on a special series of reports on NBC Nightly News this week.
You smell like smoke.
Well, my hair was on fire.
Till she kicked. Train service.
People in support of those who have been holed up in the White House 14 days now, having been pushed out of their locations in downtown Moscow by riot police, are now surrounding the east side of the Russian White House building. Apparently the forces of Boris Yeltsin inside the building too busy trying to take that building and fight off the defenders of the White House to look outside and try to scare those people away. We now
tanks take to the streets of Moscow. Good morning. It is Monday, October 4th. I'm Harry Smith.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Paula Zahn. Welcome to CBS This Morning. We're going to get you the latest from the bloody and chaotic scene in Moscow, as well as American reaction and analysis, plus a whole lot more. So stay with us on CBS This Morning.
Lots of business to take care of this morning, and events are unfolding even as we speak, and we'll talk to a lot of the principals involved and get you the very latest throughout the morning here on CBS This Morning.
Time to check in with Mark McEwen, who's back from the road once again.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great.
Good. Countdown is on. How are you feeling?
Just terrific.
All right.
This
Andrea,
is
hopefully
Lamar's
feeling
refresher
just as well.
course tonight, so
All
time
right.
to make him nervous.
Let's talk about the weather here. Not too much bad weather. You can see absolutely gorgeous on the map. I'll tell you where it's going to be nice coming up.
It's time to get you the latest news this morning. In the heart of Moscow, troops loyal to President Boris Yeltsin are on the offensive against rebel lawmakers. Cindy Kennard has more from Moscow on the battle for the Russian White House.
Boris Yeltsin called up his toughest and most experienced troops overnight, and a section of the city of Moscow has been turned into an urban battleground. He did it less than 24 hours after declaring a state of emergency in the Russian capital.
The massive military assault began about an hour after the sun came up in Moscow. Battlefield tanks, armored personnel carriers, and elite troops stormed the Russian parliament's White House, which had been held by anti-Yeltsin parliamentary deputies and their armed guards for nearly 2 weeks. It was Boris Yeltsin striking back against parliamentary opponents whose followers rioted through the streets of the capital city all day Sunday. with the heaviest fighting around Russia's main television center, which Yeltsin forces nearly lost in a fierce firefight. The Russian president announced the storming of the White House on national television this morning, saying he had to put down the red fascist mutiny. As he spoke, his army tanks began pounding the building, firing several rounds into the White House main entrance along the Moscow River. They also fired their cannons at offices where Yeltsin's chief rivals, Alexander Rutskoy and Parliament Chairman Ruslan Hezbollatov, were believed to be. A couple of hours into the fighting, troops loyal to Yeltsin claimed to have seized several floors of the building. But still, the battle continued raging for hours. There were reports Rutskoy was seeking peace talks, but Russia's prime minister said the only way out was absolute surrender. Remarkably, there were spectators, onlookers who stopped to watch the urban war being waged in their city. Helicopters hovered overhead, and there was no way to gauge casualties, although it seemed the parliamentary side was clearly outgunned, outnumbered, and had little hope of winning this battle.
As the battle goes on, it has become clear that what began as a constitutional crisis 2 weeks ago has now turned into a small civil war.
That was Cindy Canard reporting from Moscow this morning. President Clinton is keeping a close watch on the unfolding situation in Moscow. The president is in San Francisco today, part of a 3-day swing through California to promote his domestic agenda. But he went out of his way to voice continued support for President Yeltsin. David Martin joins us from the Pentagon with the latest on White House reaction to events overseas. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Paula. This is sort of a good news, bad news story. The bad news obviously being that there is fighting and violence in Moscow. The good news being that the Russian military apparently is obeying orders from Boris Yeltsin to put down the hardliners holding the parliament building. If anything, this is exactly what the U.S. government has been looking for, because President Clinton suggested in some of his remarks yesterday that he felt that Boris Yeltsin may have waited too long before standing up to the hardliners.
President Yeltsin has bent over backwards not to have the soldiers fire on anybody, not to promote any violence, and he may be thinking today he went too far in that, because they basically got up ahead of steam and the situation got out of control.
As long as the Russian military remains loyal to Boris Yeltsin, he will enjoy overwhelming force in this confrontation. And I think the expectation is that he will put down these hardliners. And I think the only real question is how much violence he has to use, and whether he uses so much violence that it will undermine, in this country, public support for continuing aid to Russia. Paula?
If those troops remain loyal to Boris Yeltsin, does that lessen the fear that many Americans have, you think, about U.S. security and the huge nuclear arsenals that we continue to see in that part of the world?
It should, I think. I think the only real concern about those nuclear weapons, as long as they remain under government control, the U.S. does not have to worry about them. The only real concern is if there is all-out civil war.
Long-term remnant. What's next is obviously to move on to the elections process and continue with the reforms. And we're signaling our support.
Reporting from the State Department. In Somalia, fighting that left at least 5...
Biden has said that he intends to restore order. If that means through additional force in the streets and rounding up those who oppose him, will we still continue to support him?
I think that we must support Democratic leaders who are forced to use their police powers and their military power to put down efforts to try to change the system by force. And that was what was happening yesterday. It was not in that sense widespread, but it was targeted. It did not succeed, and I think that President Yeltsin, as a Democratic leader, is bound to defend the efforts to try to return democracy and economic change and reform to the country.
How do you view, Mr. Ambassador, the potential for the fighting that is now centered in Moscow, spreading out beyond the environs of the city and into the countryside?
Brian, we've been watching it very carefully. As of now, we don't see any signs that that is happening, despite the many predictions that that was the case. And I think the people inside the Russian White House were fooling themselves with their own propaganda on this. We have seen the army move deliberately overnight, bring in elements of 3 divisions, be very firm in their effort, be willing to sacrifice people, and they have, and they've had to. It has been a difficult and bloody course. The resistance inside has been significant, if pinpointed, and we see that loyalty continuing, and we treat that as a sign that serious Russians know and understand the difference between a return to communism, which the people inside the White House would like to push, and the effort to continue the democratic reform process, which they supported so firmly in April.
But do you not see the violence having some residual effect on Yeltsin's call for negotiations and future elections?
But I think we have to look and see who started the violence and where that violence came from. And you had, in a sense, these focused mobs yesterday overrunning police and barriers. The police were very cautious in not shooting in, tried to contain the situation. You had a man who then organized the mob to attack specific objectives. They didn't succeed in the main, particularly on the Ostankino television attack. But of course, the government then had to restore law and order, and they made a firm commitment to do so. And I believe we must respect their responsibilities to carry out those functions.
Final question. The embassy is in close proximity to the Parliament building. Is it secure?
The embassy has been secure. It has not been attacked. We had one Marine on observation duty wounded just as he was moving away from his observation post to return to the embassy. All of our people are safe. The women and children and families are in a gymnasium we have, which happens to be underground, and there have been stray shots that have hit the embassy, but none that we know of that have been pinpointed against us. We still have snipers in the neighborhood, so we're staying buttoned up.
All right, Thomas Pickering, U.S. Ambassador to Moscow. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you, Brian.
We're going to go back to Moscow right now and talk with Andrei Kortunov. He is an analyst at the USA-Canada Institute in Russia, a Russian think tank. He's atop our NBC News Bureau in Moscow. Mr. Kortunov, good morning.
Morning.
How much in control of the situation right now is President Yeltsin?
Well, I think that speaking in terms of the military situation, he got his control over the situation in Moscow, and you can see that the violence is localized and there is traffic as usual in the streets of Moscow. However, in terms of political control, I'm afraid it's just the very beginning of a very, very long process.
During the attempted coup 2 years ago, we saw Yeltsin supporters filling the streets of Moscow, yet they've not been as evident this time around. Why not? Where have they been? Where's Yeltsin's support?
Well, first of all, I think that the democratic forces are split, because even people who support Yeltsin can condemn him for the violation of the Constitution. After all, it was President Yeltsin who disbanded the Supreme Soviet and triggered the whole events that we saw here in Moscow during the last 2 days. Therefore, he is at least partially responsible for the bloodshed. On the other hand, I think that the society is less political oriented as it was 2 years ago, and many people simply do not care about politics any longer. They just mind their business.
What effect do you think the violence is going to have on his call for elections and on people's view of him in the streets?
I think that in terms of Yeltsin's political standing, it will erode after these events. I think that both branches of the power, the parliament or the former parliament and the president, have lost in terms of their popularity and public appeal. Therefore, we can expect new power centers, in particular the regional leaders, to come to the scene here in Moscow and to impose their rules of the game on President Yeltsin.
After the Parliament building is secured, what then? Do you see the violence being extended to the streets as the pro-Yeltsin forces try to take control of the streets of Moscow?
Well, I don't think so. I think that the opposition right now is not able to mobilize major forces and people to get to the streets and to support their cause. However, I think the danger is that by outlawing the opposition, Yeltsin is pushing the opposition to the underground, and we might see some sporadic violence, some random violence, and probably even some terrorist acts in the streets of Moscow.
Andrei Kortunov, thank you very much. 7-11. Katie?
Right, we're going to head out to San Francisco, where White House correspondent Jim Miklaszewski has been traveling with the president. President Clinton, of course, is there.
The wind would carry them in the direction of the White House. They're about, I guess, a half mile now west of the White House. High in the sky. Small arms fire continues around the White House. We watch these three helicopters.
If men do emerge from those helicopters, they face, as Eileen told us earlier, the possibility, at least, of sniper fire from the roof of the White House.
That's absolutely correct, Jonathan. There were many men up there, about a dozen every night, sometimes less, depending on how cold it was and how they thought things were going. Those helicopters are right, literally above our heads right now. We can't get them right now from our camera position because they are right above our heads.
As we listen to those helicopters overhead, these motorized howitzers carrying Black Beret troops are on the move again, moving across the bridge on Kutuzovsky Prospect. They are headed directly for a line of water tank trucks that are used to wash Moscow streets. You see fleeing in front of them some bystanders who have been gawking from the bridge there watching this activity. They've gone by those two T-80 tanks, which have opened fire from the front of the White House building.
There are other major developments elsewhere in the world today. We'll have those stories after this.
Only you. Now, for the first time on TV, here are the Platters with 40 of their famous original hits for you to enjoy.
You've got